Welcome, welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us on this evening. This is our second week of African Caribbean MixFest. I am incredibly excited for tonight's conversation. I think the conversation we're going to have tonight is going to tie in really, really well with the plays that we've been watching this past week and this week as well. My name is Guadalís Del Carmen. I am the co-producer of this year's MixFest, and I'm also the co-artistic director, excuse me, of the Latinx Playwrights Circle. I am incredibly happy to welcome you all to this evening's conversation. A few house rules. The chat is open to interact with us. Please, please, please interact with us. We're trying to get as close to live theater as possible. So we want to hear your, how you're feeling in this moment as we're having this conversation. So feel free to put in your reactions, so to speak, in the chat. We just ask that you keep things, keep it kosher, keep it kind, keep it respectful. If you have any questions for our panelists, there is a Q&A button on the bottom there. Please put your questions in there. So reactions in the chat, questions for our panelists in the Q&A. I will now hand things over to our amazing moderator for this evening, Alisha Espinosa, and I will see you all later.
Gracias, Guadalís. Hola a todos. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Alisha Espinosa. I am the Director of Education and Outreach for the Latinx Playwright Circle, an actor and a playwright as well. And I am so happy to welcome you all to have an amazing discussion with our two panelists about who is the Caribbean today. I'm going to allow both of our panelists to introduce themselves and give you a quick preview of their a window into their expertise and how they're going to frame our conversation and make us all just more knowledgeable and more fully versed in what it means to be Caribbean in the United States and contemporary Caribbean issues. So we're going to do it the Zoom way, and I'm just going to pass it off to Dr. Maddox to start us off.
Thank you so much, Alisha. So my name is Tayesha Maddox, and I'm a historian of the African diaspora, specifically researching Caribbean immigration to the United States. I'm currently an assistant professor at Fordham University. And under my, wheelhouse of expertise, I look at Caribbean immigration in the early 19th century, or I should say the late 19th century, early 20th century. So my subjects traveled to the United States, particularly New York City, from 1890 to 1940. And I'm specifically looking at what happens in this period when Caribbean immigrants came to the United States. Where did they settle? How did they form communities? How did they create an identity for themselves? Because a lot of Caribbean immigrants at the time were coming into contact with other people from the Caribbean. So how do they even form a Caribbean identity outside of their home island? That's one of the things I really look at, this idea of a shared Caribbean identity. And then at the same time, while navigating this idea of what it means to be Caribbean outside of the Caribbean, also what it means to be Black in America. Because I look at people from the Afro-Caribbean, particularly the English-speaking Caribbean, so people coming from Barbados, Trinidad, I would say Guyana, because it's Caribbean Basin, even though not a Caribbean island, and St. Lucia, where my family is from. So I'm particularly interested in that area. But then once they're here, how do they form community and how do they become involved, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, where we have a lot going on in the Black community? How do they become involved in politics? And so I look at Caribbean immigrants forming social organizations, which start as social organizations, but then lead to grassroots political organizing groups. So they form what were mutual aid societies and benevolent associations. And in these groups, they do everything. They become welcoming societies for Caribbean immigrants, but then they also start to organize with the Black community to fight for rights of Black people in the United States. So I think that's a really brief summary, and we, of course, can talk more about what I do. So thank you, everyone. So happy to be here this evening.
And we're absolutely going to talk a lot about it. maybe I think Guadalís learned this earlier today. I'm the tiniest bit of a history nerd. So welcome to the party, everybody. Dr. Cabezas, please introduce yourself. Tell us more about your work.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me here. I've been studying sex tourism since the mid-90s and the sex worker movement in Latin America. And so I'm still involved with the scholarship in the area. I think my interest is because I am an immigrant from Cuba, de Cuba a Los Angeles, from Cuba to California. And so I'm interested in the Spanish-speaking islands in Cuba, República Dominicana, and Puerto Rico. And so my research basically started off in Cuba, looking at what at the time was called sex tourism by scholars, but everyday people call it jinetero or jinetera, and it was understood as a hustler or someone who is accompanying tourists in resort areas or in Havana. And that companionship involved dancing and meals and taking the tourists to the beach. And sometimes it developed into friendships, and sometimes there was sex, romance, friendship involved. And so there was a very fluid notion of the jinetero or jinetera as someone who was just hustling, and everybody understood people are just getting by. And things begin to shift, I think, rapidly, so that by the mid-90s, when I was doing my research in Havana and in tourist areas, it was primarily Black Cubans who were being identified as sex workers or involved in this nebulous category, this academic category of sex tourism. And so the sex tourism from the very beginning for me is a racialized category that often involves, that is visible when it involves racialized bodies. And there's elements of class, and there's also different social identities that heighten the visibility of some people as being hypersexual, as being prostitutes. And then there are other people who can do the same kinds of practices and activities and not get marked as in a stigmatized category. So I did some work a few years ago that continues this research. I looked at Dominicans going into Puerto Rico and the women who work there in the sex trade. And some of the same dynamics happen there. It's the Dominican women who are racialized and are considered to be the sex workers, a stigmatized category, but that doesn't seem to get applied to other people in different socioeconomic class or people who can pass in other ways or who are not Dominicans. And more recently, I'm studying an organization based out of Argentina, called Retrasex. And this is an organization that links all the sex worker movement organizations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean into a network. And so I'm doing some research with them. So I hope that gives you an idea of my interests.
Yeah, that's great. That's a perfect just taste of some of what we're going to get into. And We're going to do it a little different than those of you who were here with us last week. I'm going to sort of do our conversation a little piecemeal. We're going to talk about immigration, its history, and then we're going to, with Dr. Maddox, and then we're going to move over to Dr. Cabezas and talk about the Caribbean itself and how some of these things intermingle. But I do want to welcome both of our panelists. Please chime in whenever you have something to add. Please feel free to add it. I'm also just... I can do the link and do the moderating too. So I found the retrasex.org website. So I'm just putting that link in the chat. Amazing. Okay, great. And so with that said, I just want to turn to Dr. Maddox a little more specifically. Because I think before we can talk about who the Caribbean is now, we have to talk about the Caribbean in the United States specifically, and of course, the Caribbean itself. We got to talk about all those things that you specialized in, 1890s to the 1940s. I'm particularly interested in what immigration would have looked like if you were coming from the Caribbean then, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand how immigration was very different from the 1890s to 1924 and from 1924 to, let's say, 1960. So if you could just give us a little primer in that.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So one of the reasons I study this earlier period is because most of the research on Caribbean immigration tends to focus on the period after 1965. And that's when we have the Reunification Act. So in 1965, we see a boom of immigration from the Caribbean. So there are just more groups of people coming from the Caribbean. And so that period is often like focused on when we look at Caribbean immigration. And I wanted to look at this earlier period because there, of course, were people who were coming to the US at this time, really influential people. Even people like Marcus Garvey, although he never naturalized, he was in New York City in the 1920s, right? So I was always interested in who are these people. I often read stories of these famous, influential African Americans who were doing these great things. And then to come to find out they were immigrants from the Caribbean. So I was like, wait, what's happening here? Why are so few people talking about this? So my research starts in this earlier period, and one of the biggest differences we see in immigration in the early 1900s and in the later 1900s is just the quantity of immigrants. There was a way smaller group of people who were coming over, and then the types of people who were coming over. So in the earlier period, we had people who had means to travel. They were often more educated. We had a lot of women who were coming in the early 20th century, larger numbers than had traveled previously. So when I teach a class on Caribbean, like general Caribbean history, and we talk about the boom of inter-Caribbean migration. And so we look, of course, at the Panama Canal and Caribbean immigrants who were going to Costa Rica to work, and Central America in general, to work on a railroad that was being built, and then eventually the Panama Canal. And in that period, we see lots of young men who are traveling at that time to fill work positions. And then there's a shift and there's a change in the 1900s where we see women traveling for the first time, and they're traveling in mass numbers, more so than the men. And this is because they were going to fill domestic roles. There was also this idea of kind of like a chain of migration where a woman would go, set up a household, and then bring her family, or bring her sister, or bring her friend, or bring her other, recommend people to come. So we have large numbers of Caribbean women that were traveling at the time. So I think that's definitely a big difference. As I mentioned, a lot of them were educated, not having a lot of money, but definitely having education. The issue is when they got to America, because of the racist laws that were Jim Crow laws that were set in place at the time, they weren't often able to obtain career positions in the fields that they had studied. So then they would take on work such as domestic work, elevator operators. Being a Pullman porter was definitely a field that was looked at as desirable for young Caribbean immigrants coming to the US. So I think that's one of the big differences in this immigration that we see. And then, so there's more so a free kind of migration that's happening to the United States. Very few issues for Caribbean immigrants coming. And then we have World War II, or not World War II, World War I. World War I happens. And shortly after World War I, there's this feeling of xenophobia in the United States. And so they start enforcing more strict or harsher immigration laws. And so one of the laws that were passed is the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. And this set a national quota for every country. And many of the immigrants that I come from, or many of the immigrants that I study, come from the British Caribbean. So they were under the purview of Great Britain. And so Great Britain only allowed a certain amount, a very tiny amount of immigrants to come from the United States under their quota. And so forth for many of the other islands in the Caribbean that were colonial possessions at the time. And so this drastically cuts down the number of people who are coming into the United States and limiting the number of migrants who were not from Northern European countries. So we see a dismal effect on immigration from the Caribbean after 1924, and it almost stops. It's not again until 1965 that we start to see, well, actually that's not true. In the 1940s, with the entry of the US into World War II, then we have a boom where the United States makes an agreement with certain Caribbean islands to have workers come from the Caribbean to fill in positions of Americans who are off at war. So we have a program where Caribbean immigrants are coming in, but realistically, it's not till 1965 with the Family Reunification Act that we then begin to see large numbers of Caribbean immigrants from all over the Caribbean coming into the United States. And then the type of people who were coming in at that time were all over social economic classes, different levels of education, taking on different kinds of positions. And so I think that's the major difference in what we see in terms of like Caribbean immigration from the early 1900s to the later 1900s.
It's such a fascinating topic. I think for many reasons, which I'll try not to get into too deeply, but we don't discuss Johnson Reed, we don't discuss family reunification, we don't discuss Hart-Celler in United States history.
Yeah.
And even more deeply, we don't discuss the Jones Act of 1918, right? Another thing that like why a lot of Caribbean immigration doesn't totally stop is because the migration from Puerto Rico is possible because of the Jones Act, right? Which is possible because, of course, they needed more draftees for World War I. So all of these elements sort of tying together. Just my own hobby horse I'm going to get on. There's no such thing as a passport until 1924 to enter the United States of America. Applying to immigrate to the United States is not an idea that anyone had until that point. And it's specifically to limit racially what the United States looks like.
There aren't as many of these tests that they had to take, like literacy tests and things like that weren't instituted until later. We see that come later as a means to restrict people from coming in, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, everyone go to Ellis Island when everything's good to go, but right, they'll teach you about the medical test is not a medical test as you would think. It is grosser and yet somehow more inefficient than you would expect it to be. But all of the gateways get locked. They start building them so fewer people can come. And then what I think then like the result of it that I think is really interesting and is maybe smack dab in your wheelhouse, Dr. Maddox, is how mutual aid, how communities then continue to create, we're going to link this to your website, but the New York City, the Caribbean capital, can you talk a little bit more about that and how that aids immigration and what we know today of our society in terms of the...
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in my work, which is currently out for review. So hopefully we'll have something by next year. In my work, I talk about these mutual aid societies and benevolent associations and how they're like instrumental to helping the Caribbean immigrant community to form community. They are often the predecessors or they come after Caribbean friendly societies, which were a relic post-emancipation in the Caribbean. And they often served as burial and insurance organizations that helped Caribbean people take care of themselves, to have autonomy. They often pool their money, and what a lot of Caribbean islands know, things like susus and the box, where it was like a collective saving strategy. And so they take these ideas with them from the Caribbean, they export them and take them to the United States. And these organizations often become, as I mentioned before, welcoming societies for Caribbean immigrants, helping them find housing, helping them find jobs, becoming registered, naturalized. They often had politicians coming to the meetings so that they could advocate for immigrant rights. So these organizations were instrumental. And for many people, it also just was a reminder of home, especially if you were a young person coming to the United States or to New York, and you had very few friends or family here. The organization became your family. If you were sick, they provided what was an early form of like workers' comp. So they paid you, I think, something like $5 a week every week that you were sick. If you hurt yourself in the job, they would provide funds for you. They often had visiting committees that would come to the hospital to make sure you're okay. And so they really served as a sense of community and family for immigrants that I think made it a lot easier for people to stay in the United States. Because many come with this idea that they're going to come to the United States for a few years, work, and then go home. But then they start to develop family through these organizations. Many people meeting their spouses or just being able to stay in the U.S. in a more comfortable and familiar way, if they had not belonged to these organizations. So yeah, so I think these mutual aid organizations are definitely key and instrumental in helping build this Caribbean community. And then another thing that's interesting about them is they begin to do work with African American organizations, mutual aid organizations. So then they become really entrenched in what's happening in the Black community. And they also make these connections to each other. And so they're going to each other's meetings. They start as social organizations. So they're going to card parties. They're having bus trips. They're having a good time.
Yes.
They're part of Bid List. They often had these played these card games called Bid Whist together. And so I remember when I was first researching, I'm like, why are they all playing? What is Bid Whist? I have to look this up. Why are they all playing this game? But yeah, so they're having all these social. They go to church together, and so they're really forming a community. And like I mentioned before, not only are they coming together in terms of like from wherever island they're from, but they're also forming a pan-Caribbean identity. Because for many people, this is the first time. If you're from Jamaica, you probably had not been to Trinidad or met anyone from Trinidad, but you become Caribbean in the United States, and then you form this community. And so again, at the same time as they're forming this community of this Caribbean community, they're also forming a Black identity in working together and socializing and living with Black Americans. And this is the period I study, 1920s, is a period of migration, the Great Migration from the many cities in the US South to northern states, such as New York. And so you have young people from North and South Carolina, from Alabama, also coming to New York City for the first time. So it becomes just a conglomerate of people coming and new to the city and forming these communities and groups together. Even my own family, I think I always tell the story about how I'm the daughter of migrants on both sides, because my mom came from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia when she was in her teens. But then my dad's family, they migrated to New York. My grandmother and my grandfather, they migrated to New York in the 1930s themselves. So, so they're also migrants. So I think it's really interesting how these groups come together in this period.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. Just for fun in the chat, everybody, you said bidwist, and all I could think was spades and dominoes
Yes.
in my
it was
house.
The spades and dominoes of the day.
Yes, yes. So pop off in the chat, spades, dominoes, pinochle sometimes is in there too, right? If you're like bidwist, who is playing bidwist? But these are the sort of the cultural I don't know, I guess the ancestors of those games, right?
It's
bidwist.
true, because I remember in college, everyone played spades, and that was the thing, like we were spades. And now I'm reading these stories and I'm like, oh, so this was spades for them. This is what they were doing at the time.
Yes.
It's a great correlation.
I think it's so interesting too, maybe to shift our conversation more to this, the colonization, right? Like what the impact of the Caribbean from the United States, and then to immigrate to the United States. How do all these things interplay with each other? But I also been really fascinated by what you said earlier about all of these Black figures that you're like, wait, they immigrated from the Caribbean. Wait, so why can you speak at all to like why that is? Isn't it a assimilation thing? Is it just a strange part of history that gets taken out? Like nobody thinks to care about it. What is that like?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. I think in the earlier period, because there were so few numbers of Caribbean immigrants coming, they often, and the groups that I study, the people I'm talking about are often from the English-speaking Caribbean. They're Black, so immediately they just get lumped into this group of African Americans, and they were actively a part of the African American community, and they saw themselves as part of that community.
Well, and I'm thinking Schomburg as well.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely, he's an extraordinary figure. But yeah, so they are part of they're part of these groups. But then I think when we do the history, especially from an American perspective, we don't look at those. But I think it's important. I think it was important to point out, because these are, and this is not an idea of like Caribbean exceptionalism or anything, but I think there's something that's interesting about these people who come to the United States. It's a part of their personality and character that you can't leave out, that they migrated, because that's a really important part of their story. And what that means, that they were people who were transnational. They were living in both places. They always had their eyes on not just what was happening in the United States, but they were also really heavily involved in Caribbean politics, in West Indian Federation. They were interested in the decolonization process that was happening in the Caribbean. So I think when you don't talk about their origins, I think it takes away a part of that story. And I don't know, I think it has to do with the fact that these people were often from the Anglophone Caribbean, and so they just get lumped in.
I think that's such an interesting point, the language, right, as an identifier, especially when we're talking about a time that is less nuanced in some ways about the way that it labels people, but then also less nuanced and more nuanced. I feel like sometimes we get into even bigger quagmires about like, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Caribbean? And then we can kind of put our own foot in our mouth in a way that's exclusionary and also nuanced. So I think that's really fascinating. And I'm going to continue to talk more, because I want to bring in Dr. Cabezas here, this idea of, so we're talking about people moving from the Caribbean to the United States, but then we also have to account for maybe the more contemporary movement of tourism in the Caribbean. How is that? You know, to start, you did a really, you already did this a little, Dr. Cabezas, but if you could do it again, defining sex tourism for us. What is it? Why is it? How did it become what it became?
Well, some of the early studies in the 1970s were done in Jamaica, and it looked primarily at young men who were having romantic and sexual relationships with tourists. And there's other connections as well that we can look at for the where this comes from. We have to look primarily at US intervention in the area and military bases in Haiti, in Panama, in Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, because that brings in the young soldiers. And part of the masculinity that is constructed in the military was this sexual access that they were permitted to have. This is not just for this hemisphere, but also US interventions in Southeast Asia, for example, in those military bases, created a demand for prostitution because it was the rest and recreation of the military, the soldier. So you have in places like Panama, for example, these economies that are created, that are attached to the military base, where you have nightclubs and cabarets and all types of recreational entertainment forms that appeal to men. And by the way, these were very, very segregated, always very segregated districts. And you had men coming in when they were on leave, these so-called military boys, and looking to have relationships with some of the women that were there. Many of them were coming from the British colonies. They had, as Dr. Maddox had pointed out, they had already migrated in the 19th century to Costa Rica, Guatemala, to Nicaragua, to Panama, and they would move around. And as Dr. Maddox pointed out, a lot of these women use the chain migration to bring their children, for example, once they were established in places like Panama. But they moved around a lot. You know, there was just migration, a lot of migration. So you have that transnational aspect of what in Panama they call the Sabana Blanca, the white waves. And these were the military boys that were dressed in white uniforms, and they would just flood the streets of Panama City looking for entertainment and rest and recreation.
It's so interesting you said it, because we have Fleet Week in New York City, right? This is the idea, except we've sanitized it for when it's on our shores.
Yes, yes. And I think it was very sanitized in racialized in particular ways. So in Panama, as I mentioned, it was segregated, where you had the Black women working in districts that were considered to be red light districts. They were not allowed to leave these areas. They had to register with the police and pay a tax. They had to carry a card. But then you went to the more high-class cabarets in another part of the city, and these places, you had a lot of women from the United States that had gone to work there. And so it was a way of creating, these women were considered to be entertainers and respectable. And, but in fact, that you know, a lot of the women knew they were former sex workers in the US in places like New York, and they took the ferry to Panama to be able to sell sex with a certain degree of anonymity and to have an abundance of clients. And so those women were protected. They were more reputable. And there's a whole slew of Hollywood movies and plays that were done about the women and the encounters that happened in Panama that were not considered to be that were not considered to be sex work, but were in fact hidden in particular ways in those places. So to go back to your question, you have an influx of people coming into the Caribbean, especially in the 20th century, when we see a shift from plantation economies to tourism economies. When we move away from sugar, for example, in the Dominican Republic, into creating resorts. And these resorts attract people that want to get away from it all. They want to have different experiences that are exotic and perhaps erotic, and they want to meet the local people and have lots of drinks and perhaps have a fling with someone that's local. So it's a way for the tourists to alter their everyday behavior. They're no longer working the crazy hours that we work here in the US. They're in a great mood and they're drinking up a storm. And so you have these young people that are constantly patrolling the tourist areas, looking for tourists, and so that they may be their tour guides. And then you have in the resorts, the workers who work in the resorts who are also many times open and available to having relationships with the tourists. So that creates a very interesting transnational component. And we saw the best of it with how Stella got her groove back in the late 80s with that movie, right? Based on a real life story. I think for women too, going into these places, it gives them the freedom to be dominant and more in control. So they have a certain white access to these younger men, and the relationships are considered to be a fling, a romance, and not necessarily a middle-aged woman paying for a gigolo.
Right. I'm very interested. The conversation around sex work, I think, is finally becoming complex and respectful and nuanced. And so I'm very interested in this idea of sex tourism in the Caribbean, pros and cons, maybe from the aspect of that as a basis of the economy for the women themselves. There's a lot of colorism wrapped up in sex tourism as well that has its pros and cons and issues. So I'm curious about maybe a more binary, like, what's going on there? How do we make sense of it?
Yes. So I'll start off with a colorism, because it was very interesting to see in the Dominican Republic a lot of women looking for young Black men, and they wanted guys with dreadlocks. They wanted, men under 30 with dreadlocks. And so it was very interesting that they were never interested in lighter skinned Dominicans. And these are
the sex workers, or are these people looking for sex workers?
These are the tourists.
The tourists, okay.
I'm referring to tourist women, and the tourist men also want more the mulata, the mixed race woman, mestiza, not the darker skinned woman. So Haitians, for example, that are a very large population in the Dominican Republic, they are not the people that are being sought out by the tourists. They're primarily, the men are looking for lighter skinned women. And what this has created then is many opportunities for the women to migrate. When I did my research, a lot of the women have traveled to Western Europe. They were in London, they were in Austria, they were in Spain, sometimes because their tourist boyfriend invited them. And sometimes because they went there after having worked in the sex trade in the Dominican Republic, they went into Madrid and did a stint of a couple of years working in the sex trade in Spain so that they could save money to buy a business back in the Dominican Republic or buy a home or put their kids through school. So these were family wages. I want to mention also the research of Adriana Pichatelli in Brazil. She also studies Brazilian women who go into Spain or Italy. And she's found the same thing, that they use their foreign boyfriends to be able to travel into Europe and perhaps get married, perhaps be able to stay there and bring their families. And if that doesn't work, they go back to Brazil and start all over again.
It's such an interesting, when we talk about colorism, right? The racism of desire, but then when desire is the economy for some of these women, how then that racism, I've been saying this a lot lately, I welcome everyone to start thinking this way, is affecting the pocketbooks of other women, right? Like a darker skinned woman in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, not desirable to the tourism, to the tourists coming over, and therefore will have less access to movement, less access to upward mobility. And in this way, then we also get the issue of visual representation. You know, as an actor, I'm constantly coming up against this. I don't know how I have to explain this to you, but my last name is Espinosa and I'm 100% Puerto Rican, but I'm not the mestiza who's with her foreign boyfriend. So these cycles of the racism and the colorism and how they impact how we view the Caribbean, who is Latinx in some cases, but who's Caribbean, right? And then how it affects women's money.
Yes, yes. So it has some I mean, everything from the desire that's already the racial, and the way it triggers down into all elements of the economy. So it's very important. Yeah. And we see countries, for example, Cuba, that capitalized on using Black women's bodies at a certain point to sell their tourism. And I think that has been put in check recently. But certainly, you know, we're open to tourism and look who's available.
I think actually, Dr. Cabezas, your timing is just impeccable. This is about the time that I'm gonna invite Guadalís to rejoin us, maybe from the God mic, maybe on video again, however she prefers. And we're gonna turn to our, she is nuestra diosa.
I literally listened to this conversation all day. We do have a couple of questions, and I want to make sure that we get all of them. Let's see. We have from Nick Luckenbach. Do you have, Dr. Maddox, do you have any thoughts on how the idea of mutual aid might be embraced or looked to for guidance on a broader scale as we work to build the equity and fundraising community support and financial support that is less reliant on the wealthiest individuals in our country? And I'm actually going to tie that with Omar's next question as well, because Omar asks about the Antillean Federation. And I don't know if Dr. Gabe says you're familiar with the Antillean Federation, which was like the Spanish speaking Caribbean. It was proposed for them to come together and find unity in that way and become sovereignly united. And I think both of those questions are actually fairly related when we talk about decolonizing and unifying the Caribbean, but also having access to resources. So I guess like either one of you can kind of chime in with either of those questions. And if you need me to repeat, just let me know, because I feel like I threw a million words at you.
So I guess just to answer about the mutual aid question, I think in looking, I think there's a lot that we can learn from these earlier groups of mutual aid. And I think one thing that I noticed in last year, when we saw a boom of mutual aid organizations pop up post-pandemic or during the pandemic, that mutual aid is not, and this is the thing, like, it's not charity, right? It's a collective strategy. It's people coming together and pooling their resources to help their neighbors, help their community, help their neighborhoods. And I think that's something that we need to take forward. So then that way, it's not just some charity work that you do for a day or 2 days and then you leave. It's something that helps the community for a long-term sustainable time. And I think that's something that we need to look to these older groups for, to wrap our minds around this idea of like equity and being able to have the collective good of everyone. Yeah, that's just something I wanted to add quickly.
Dr. Cabezas, do you have anything to add to that? Especially maybe you could speak more to the Antillean Federation, this idea. I think is really interesting. I'm also just going to link to an article on New York City's community fridges. That was a mutual aid thing that became more popular suddenly. If you haven't read about it, I highly recommend.
Yes, thank you for bringing up the Antillean Federation, because I think there were a lot of movements and gestures during the 19th century, for example, to start thinking about a unified area. And we've seen some of this happen also in Latin America, especially when Chavez was still alive and before all the US sanctions against Venezuela, of thinking about a way of unifying the area. But I want us to think about the ecological devastation that we are currently experiencing, and the ways in which we are going to have to rethink everything if we are to survive in this planet. So one of the things to think about then, and I think this goes into thinking about the sovereignty for Puerto Rico and thinking about tourism, is to begin from the point of view of what is sustainable for the region in terms of ecological resources. How are we going to be able to survive? How are we going to honor and live in harmony with our planet? And I think that could be a good base for coming together, and not some of the other efforts that have been created by the IMF or the World Bank, or by elite puppet governments that are currently in power in the region. So begin from the point of view of a sustainable planet and a sustainable region.
Yeah, and just going off what you're saying, the Antillean Federation as an idea of like, who it has the most at stake right now in terms of climate change, and it is the Caribbean. It is one of the riskiest areas to be inhabiting right now. And how can maybe a sense of sovereignty or a sense of unity within all of those areas create the change and the solidarity, the mutual aid that we might need to deal with this crisis, I think is really fascinating. I'm also going to plug something else in the chat.
I was going to say, I just proposed a course for Fordham, a new course that I'm teaching, and it looks at race, environmental justice, and climate change. And I'm talking about this very idea about how, although the Caribbean is not one of the largest producers of like greenhouse gases, right? They're being the most adversely affected, because when we have rising sea waters, that directly affects the Caribbean, who are at lower elevations. We see the sea moss problem, that seagrass problem that's happening in the Mexican coast and some of the Caribbean islands, the southern Caribbean islands. Like, all of these things are directly affecting the Caribbean. So I agree with Dr. Cabezas about this. Like, we need to there's something that really needs to be done and looked at in a more realistic approach of how we can help these communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mistake everyone made was thinking that Katrina was some sort of outlier of an event as opposed to presaging what is going to happen on a larger scale to larger areas of the country. Um, Hurricane Maria is an unfortunately just perfect example of this kind of devastation. The island still has not recovered. And then we're talking about, just to nod to what Dr. Cabezas has been talking about, tourism, right? Islands that are highly rooted in tourism for their economy being affected not just by the environmental disaster of a hurricane, but a current environmental disaster of a pandemic, and how all these things are the great grandchildren of colonialism and its impacts. Someone wrote this in the chat, and I'm not
Or
gonna.
even,
Yeah.
I was gonna say, even the fact that, like, for instance, some of these Caribbean islands, their GDP is 70% tourism. And what happens when you can't have tourism in your communities because it directly puts your population at risk? So it's a really interesting thing to be looking at right now and talking about it, and important.
It's so important. And someone mentioned this in the chat, and I'm not going to touch it because I could talk for 2 hours on this topic, but Puerto Rico's statehood status. Before you form any opinions on that, I would highly recommend War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson A. Dennis. That's all I'm going to say about it, unless Dr. Cabezas wants to open that can of worms with me, but I'm gonna try to keep my mouth shut, but yo soy boricua, I got opinions. Let me see.
I think we have one. Please open the can. Oh, sis, we need more time.
We need a whole, you better tell the Atlantic, like, we gonna set up a whole panel. We could call the government. I'll be happy to school them on just Puerto Rican sovereignty.
Listen,
Want to do that? I'll do it. I'll be there.
We'll go to one last question before we part ways. This is a great question from Akili Brown. Do either Dr. Maddox or Dr. Cabezas work as consultants for creative projects, scripts, film productions, plays? If so, what's their process? And can we reach out to you to ask you questions to consult on our work?
Well, I'll start with that. I am guilty of being very, very interested in creative projects and then not having enough time to follow through. So it's something that I would love to do, but it's very difficult because of time constraints.
I have worked in a couple of things, just consulting, giving some historical knowledge on certain things before. I don't really have a process. It's not established. I've gotten some requests, and I usually just follow through whatever whatever they're requesting.
That's great.
But I definitely would be more interested in doing things like that. Absolutely.
Well, you're going to see a lot more of your material being used. And I know there are playwrights and actors and dramaturgs listening here. And now we have all of this access to your resources that we can go, oh, let me go check myself, and maybe write an email to either of you, see if you can join me in that. It's very exciting. The focus you both have, especially Dr. Maddox, just the way that you're investigating this period of Caribbean immigration and how it fits into our understanding of Black activism. But then also, Dr. Cabezas, this question of sex tourism. How is it affecting the region? How is it affecting women? What power does it give them? And how does this change what the Caribbean looks like and what it means to move to the United States? I think is so fascinating. Aquila says, expect a call. So you both have to free up your calendars.
Amazing. I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you both so much, Dr. Maddox and Dr. Cabezas, for joining us this evening and being part of a MixFest and being part of this new way that we're doing theater for now until, fingers crossed, until not after this year. But thank you all again for joining us on this evening. We still have two more presentations that will round out the rest of MixFest. We have Tigress by France Luce Benson, directed by Away Tempo, happening tomorrow. If you haven't RSVP'd by that, please go to atlantic.org and RSVP for that presentation. And then my play, Ashiro's Journey, or What Anakaon and Yemaya Taught Me, also directed by Away Tempo. That one is on Friday. And we also have last night's collection of short plays is available on Atlantic's YouTube. They're gorgeous plays. You will definitely see a lot of themes that we've spoken about this evening in these works. So I hope that, you know, this evening provided everyone with information and perspective from where a lot of Caribbean playwrights are coming from when we write our works and when we create our worlds and then present them to you all. So thank you all again, and we will see you soon. Good night, everyone.
Thank you again to our panelists. You were
Thank
excellent.
you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.